So greetings to all. Welcome to this forum to protest the Israeli-U.S. attack on Iran. The program is being co-sponsored by Promoting Enduring Peace, the Middle East Crisis Committee, and Maruf, which stands for Muslim Advocacy for Rights, Unity, and Fairness. Now, I'll note now two subtitles of the call for the meeting: Stop Selling Weapons to Israel. Down with all the fascist and theocratic regimes. We are not neutral. We naturally oppose the aggression against Iran, but we want to make it clear we in no way stand with any kind of support for the Iranian regime, which suppresses workers, feminists, environmentalists, and all kinds of dissent. Here are some questions that we may get into today. How do we explain our total opposition to the attack on Iran by the genocidal Israeli regime without giving support to the vicious theocracy ruling Iran? Why did Iran spend so much on its nuclear program when it doesn't even have any air defense from Israeli and U.S. aircraft? Should Iran's supposed right to nuclear weapons be supported, or should all nuclear development be opposed in Iran and everywhere? Perhaps stating the obvious, don't the attacks on Iran violate international law, treaties, and in our case here in the States, the U.S. Constitution? What actions on our part might have some effect on the public? Rallies, marches, boycotts, memes, what works? What's good? What should we be trying? And what's happening around the world? As critics of the Iranian regime, how do we keep away monarchists? And if you've gone to some rallies about Iran, you'll see they pop up. And finally, does Trump's displeasure at Israel in the last day or so mean anything, or is it verbal sop to his America First supporters? Can we use that in any way, or should we ignore it? Now, we have some changes in the program. Our first speaker was going to be Michael Karagias, and just a half hour before we began, he wrote and said he woke up really sick. He's in Australia. It's 9 a.m. there. And so we're very sorry for that. And I hope you'll look on him on Facebook and see what he's been writing about this subject and others. Our third speaker was to be Evan Siegel, and unfortunately something has come up and we'll have to hear his view some other time. But that does give us more time for Yassamine Mather and more time for discussion. So our first formal speaker is Yassamine Mather. She's an Iranian socialist, acting editor of the academic journal Critique, and a regular contributor to Weekly Worker. Her last article there was titled Peering into the Darkness, in which she questioned the Western nuclear bomb narrative, discouraged the chances of managed regime change, and insisted that Israel's war is not only against the regime. Yassamine Mather.
Thank you very much. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
No. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll try and, because most people will probably know what is going on, I'll try and be more precise and wait for your questions, comments. But I think I want to start with the nuclear threat. First of all, there is the hypocrisy of Israel having a large number. My understanding is over 100 nuclear bombs. Complaining about Iran maybe getting to a stage where it can build a bomb. So no one, including IAEA, including the US, is saying that Iran has a nuclear bomb. What is being said is that the level of enrichment is high, and therefore at some stage Iran might reach that situation. Now, I'm against nuclear weapons. I also believe the current stage of nuclear industry is questionable in most of the world, and therefore I've been campaigning for years for a nuclear-free Middle East. But a nuclear-free Middle East would start with Israel giving up its nuclear weapons as well. And I think here what we are seeing is an excuse, but it's easy. It's been repeated so many times that there is this threat of nuclear bomb, and it's been repeated for such a long time that it's easy for it to be in our own subconscious. So I remember Netanyahu mentioning the threat of Iran achieving nuclear military capability 20 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Every time you look at, he's been saying, oh, Iran is on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. It used to be a few months, a few weeks, now a few days. So this is not the real reason. I think Israel is very keen to get rid of regional rivals. And in this, Iran is considered, with its 90 million population, with a young population that is technically quite advanced for a global South country, Israel really doesn't want Iran as an entity. It would rather Iran was replaced by smaller countries, independent Kurdish Iran, Baluchistan Iran, and all the rest of it. It's very difficult to know what the negotiations of the last few months between Iran and US were about. Now, inside Iran, the perception of quite a lot of people is that they were to fool Iran into a sense of security before Israel attacked. I think it's more complicated than that. I think for various reasons, Trump did want to follow these negotiations, but Israel was definitely against any negotiation with Iran. And as we enter this period of this very fraught period of ceasefire, I think Israel will be still very worried about any negotiations that might lead to a lasting peace around this particular question. For Israel, I think the timing also coincided with the time when European countries were beginning to openly criticize genocide, starvation. The term genocide was being used for the first time in European media, especially in France and Britain, a term that only a couple of months ago, you couldn't use. As you know, the UK had put sanctions against 2 of Netanyahu's ministers. So the pressure was, especially the pictures of starvation in Gaza, the pictures of genocide in Gaza, were changing a little bit. I'm not saying there was a dramatic change, but changing the way some European governments were reacting to events in Gaza. And of course, for all of these reasons, it was very good for Netanyahu to divert attention. The bombing of Iran, at least from what I see, has changed headlines. Instead of the headlines that were dominating the news in terms of bombing of hospitals, bombing of starved Palestinians, the attention went to this war. And therefore, I think these are the reasons more than the nuclear reason. But we'll come back to the nuclear issue later, maybe in Q&A. I think we also are looking at a very dark period globally when the so-called leader of the free world, I never thought it was free world under any of the US presidents, but the so-called leader of the free world goes around saying, oh, we can assassinate a leader of another country. It really is a terrible situation where, for whatever reason, physicists, scientists who are working on a project for a country that is a dictatorship, and therefore you can't be in its universities and not do what the government asks you to do, are assassinated in their homes, in their place of work. And this isn't just the last 10 days during the so-called 12-day war. This has been happening for years in Iran. So we are in a situation where I would imagine if any other country, imagine a Latin American country, had gone around assassinating people that it didn't like, not just military people, but even military people in its neighboring country or in a country in its region. And the world just sat and said, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with it because the state is a rogue state. It just makes a mockery of international law, makes a mockery of this so-called international communities that is often referred to, but which really means the US and its allies. The bombing of Iran has had an effect mainly on civilians, and that is why I don't think we could claim this was just a war between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. The victims have been some of the leadership of the Revolutionary Guards, but in much larger numbers, around 700, my understanding is, civilians have been killed. And of course, Israel's publicity is all about civilians killed in Israel, which is also terrible, but it claims that its targets were all extremely accurate. If you send a drone into an apartment building in the middle of Tehran to kill a scientist who happens to live there, his or her neighbors wouldn't know he lives there, and they are the victims of that building collapsing. We have a lot of information about people completely unrelated to the government who've been killed in the last 2 weeks. The purpose was to weaken Iran's infrastructure, never mind just the nuclear installations. Quite a lot of the refineries have been attacked. Oil depots have been attacked. So the idea is to weaken the economy of the country. In some ways, people have said the purpose was, if not the dream of Netanyahu to overthrow the Iranian government, but to downgrade Iran in terms of economy, infrastructure, and so on. When it comes to the nuclear sites, my understanding from tonight's reports is that even the US bombing, which happened on Saturday evening, has not damaged entirely or destroyed entirely Iran's nuclear program. And you could have predicted that because these are so deep in underground, and the Iranian government knew this was happening. They claimed they moved some stuff. Even if they hadn't moved it, it is now obvious from leaked documents from the White House, IAEA reports, and various other reports that they have damaged very seriously Iran's nuclear program, but we are talking of months or maybe a year, not a complete destruction. So all this, if you like, heavy price that the Iranian people have paid for this cannot be justified. And of course, even before the US bombing of Saturday night, Israel was relying heavily on US planes and US support, because the planes, my understanding is that the missiles, the bombing required the planes required mid-air fueling, and the US was providing that. But of course, there is also the other allies of US in the region who helped Israel in this process. The Jordanian government allowed its airspace to be used and so on. Here, we also had both Netanyahu and Iran's monarchist saying that after the first night that the regime will fall. It's immediate. We've done one night of bombing and definitely there will be regime change. Now, for someone who has campaigned for changing the government of the Islamic Republic, I have always detested this type of regime change from above because very often they actually damage any attempt by ordinary Iranians, by the working class in Iran, to fight and overthrow this regime. On the contrary, I would say Israel has managed to strengthen the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is a very astute dictatorship. It has large numbers of organizations that are used for repression, but it also has some supporters because they are religiously affiliated with the government or politically affiliated, but there are also those whose livelihood depends on the current regime. And in the absence of any major upheavals, they are not going to give up this government. And so had there been a collapse of the government, and I didn't think it would happen, and everyone I spoke, political activists I spoke to in Iran were saying, don't underestimate this regime. Had that happened, we would have faced civil wars, we would have faced chaos. We would not have seen a smooth regime change that was being, and is still being propagated by the Western media, by sections of the Western media. We are talking of a very incompetent son of an ex-Shah, of an ex-dictator, who spent most of his life living a life of pleasure in the US. He has no intention of actually returning to Iran, that whatever Netanyahu tells you. And I think the bubble that pro-Israeli media had created, both in the Persian-speaking world, but also globally, that there is this ready and waiting alternative government to the Islamic Republic that can come to power, was just has just burst. The bubble has burst. We now know there is nothing there. So what we are facing now is this ceasefire. And of course, conflict will continue in other forms, as we know. Ceasefires don't stop the conflict. It's just, hopefully, there will be no bombings of ordinary Iranians and civilians in Israel. But what can we say in terms of what I would think the left can say about all this? Well, first of all, I agree entirely with the slogan, "No arms for Israel." And here in the UK, the government pretends it's not sending arms, or it pretends it has reduced trade, but we know that at least some of the electronic equipments and so on are associated with firms in Britain, including British Aerospace and other military providers. We should obviously oppose. In Britain, we are opposing the UK's support for Israel. It's very obvious. It's a very one-sided narrative, and that one-sided narrative showed itself throughout the Gaza war. We have a national broadcaster that has come under attack from its own staff for being biased. We have a foreign office in UK where staff complained about Britain's positions. I believe something like nearly 900 staff complained about the government's position on Israel, and they were told, well, you can resign, is the answer of the Labour government, which has nothing to do with Labour, it's just a title. So I think we do want the defeat of the US, UK allies of Israel. We want the defeat of the Israeli government. Irrespective of the ceasefire, the people of Gaza are still suffering and will continue to suffer from genocide, starvation. And it really is clear when you go, for example, to demonstrations in London, that the ordinary people of this country are completely opposed to the kind of propaganda that the state and its broadcaster put out in terms of the right of Israel to defend itself because of October 7th and so on. But then I think in Iran, the situation is very difficult. So first of all, during the bombings, I think people stopped or rallied around the nation, the country, rather than the Islamic Republic. And here, as a Marxist, I have dual feelings on this, because obviously this strong level of nationalism that Iranians have was good in the last 2 weeks, but it's bad in other aspects. It is a very patriotic type of nationalism and relies on culture, history, some of which is good, some of which is not so good. The fact that we had an empire 5,000 years ago does not really influence my opinion of the situation. But you can see that level of nationalism whenever Iran is being attacked. During the Iran-Iraq war, we saw it. We are seeing it now. So it's a dual thing. On the one hand, it's good that people didn't support Israel, but it's bad that there is this kind of false impression of superiority because of a Persian empire that was defeated after all. However, I think there are a lot of tasks that can be done in Iran in order to not just weaken the regime, but also to prepare the way for a genuine regime change from below, for uprisings and so on. And one of the ways that one has, there are many demands we can put forward. Iran is a very privatized economy. It's still in the throes of neoliberal economic policies. There's a lot of one of the sections of the populations that have been seriously affected by the war are this huge number of precatoria, workers with no major job. They are Uber drivers, food delivery people. It's a huge industry in Iran. Obviously, all of these people are now facing even worse economic situations than they ever did before. We have sections of mafia capitalism associated with various factions of the Iranian regime who control the food distribution markets and so on. And they actually benefit from sanctions. So sanctions, rather than weakening the regime, has strengthened sections of these types of mafia capitalists. And in those terms, we should demand nationalization of industries, control of these, criminalizing the activities of these black marketeers who benefit from sanctions and are associated with the government. In terms of organization, So the bombings left most Iranian people with little defense. The government could not even manage proper sirens. This is partly because the planes were too fast. This wasn't like the Iran-Iraq war where they could warn people and take them to encourage them to go to shelters. At various times, the internet was completely down. There are two stories. One is that the infrastructure for the internet was damaged. The other is that the state stopped it. But whatever the reason, warnings were not given for people to save their lives. And as a result, more people died. However, communities organized very well, self-organized. And this is something that a lot of people in Iran are telling me, is that the traditions of COVID, where people were left defenseless against the pandemic, with the state not doing what a state should do in terms of defending its citizens, local communities had organized help groups for people. And this is something that can be the foundations of communities within local committees, local councils, which are quite familiar to Iranians from the time of 1979 for a different generation, but we can see it. The state will not control prices, so there has to be a serious campaign to combat this. The state must come under pressure to continue what it had started, but very under pressure it had started it, which was the acceptance of the right of women to choose what they were. And I think the danger is that now, with the excuse of the foreign threat, quite a lot of repressive measures that had been a little bit relaxed over the last year will come back. And obviously, there has to be resistance, because if the state starts infringing on any of those limited freedoms, it will go further. There is also the issue of revenge. Now, the Iranian government is claiming that some people were agents of Mossad and helped Israel. I'm sure there were some, but what comrades inside Iran are telling me is they are fearful that the government would do the type of revenge it did at the end of Iran-Iraq war. At the end of Iran-Iraq war, the Mujahideen Khalq, supported now by neoconservatives in the US, Giuliani and so on, waged a show attack in the west of Iran. It was defeated. It was inevitable. They were supporting Saddam Hussein at the time. They were defeated, but the government took revenge by going to prisons and executing political prisoners, not just members of Mujahideen who had nothing to do with their activities in Iraq, but also the left. Quite a large number of leftist activists were executed during that period. So there is a precedence for the Iranian government taking revenge on political prisoners. We should be wary of that. And inside Iran, people are very concerned that that might happen. We have to also fight this silly ideas that you can achieve regime change by bombing people. We should campaign about this, not just about Iran, but about anywhere else. And I think that is also related to Hamas. Irrespective of whether we like Hamas or we disagree with it or we don't like it or we think it's an Islamic organization or isn't, you can't change the mood of the Palestinians in Gaza in terms of demanding their right to exist and their right to national rights by destroying or killing leaderships of an organization or killing tens of thousands of members of that organization. That kind of idea is just, first of all, it's barbaric. We are talking of barbarism, but also it has the reverse effect, because for everyone you execute, for everyone you assassinate, others will replace them. The question is, why are these forces exist in the Middle East? Well, they exist because the Europeans, the Americans were very keen for dictators in the region to get rid of leftists, to get rid of even liberal activists, but definitely the left. And it is that policy that has led to the rise of these Islamic groups, because the poor have nowhere else to turn. And mosques and clerics are using this vacuum for this. So in the long term, for the Middle East and for Iran, the solution isn't assassination. The solution isn't bombing. And we have to do what we can to make both public opinion, but also comrades and friends near us to understand the problems with this kind of short-term politics being day and night propagated by the media, at least in the UK. That's all I'm going to say. I will say a lot more in Q&A and any comments that comrades.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. I'm going to read something short that Mike Karagias wrote. I think it's worth mentioning. And then I'm going to ask the first question. It'll be a short one. And then we'll go to the audience. So just yesterday, I think, Dr. Karagias, he's a professor, I believe, of sociology at the University of Sydney. He wrote, what looked like Trump's shift towards the preferences of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf oil monarchs on a number of regional issues which were different to Israel's, except in occupied Palestine itself, spooked Israel. But by demonstrating its awesome firepower and its capacity to do immense damage, whether or not that suited Trump's timing and preferences, of which there is debate, Israel again demonstrated its main use to U.S. imperialism as a massive armored garrison state that can be used to keep the region in line when necessary. It has been said that Israel's actions awed Trump, and as a grand narcissist, he rapidly swung into first claiming it as his own, to bringing the U.S. in directly. But it's not only about Trump's ego. Israel also awed the U.S. master, reminded it again that as a colonial settler state, it remains the indispensable ally. And that's what Mike Karagias wrote yesterday. So my question, the first question is, I heard there was a very large demonstration against the attack on Iran in London, I guess it was, in Britain. Could you tell us about that?
Okay, so we have every 5 to 6 weeks demonstrations in London against Israel and the events in Gaza. And this time it was planned as a demonstration about Gaza, but then it coincided with the Israeli bombing of Iran. US hadn't yet bombed Iran, but it did, as you know, later that day. So the demonstration usually gets a few 100,000, and this time there was about 350,000 people. So mainly UK citizens of various origins, but also British, UK born, and I feel like local people. Iranians joined this demonstration in reasonably large numbers. Now, I would say, a small group were associated with the embassy, but there were a lot of Iranians living in UK who joined the demonstration who were opposed to the Islamic Republic. This included, for example, students who came from Oxford, from University College London, from King's College London. They had their own section And in it, they made clear they didn't support the Islamic Republic, but they also, for example, some of them were carrying banners because Netanyahu, if you remember, used life, woman, freedom, the protests against hijab in one of his first addresses to the Iranian people the second night after the bombing of Tehran. And they had this poster saying, don't use that slogan, you murderer. So that was the way they were trying to show, on the one hand, their solidarity with the movement that happened in 2023 in Iran, but also their opposition, 2022, but also their opposition to Israel. Other slogans about Iranian people taken hostage by Khamenei but being bombed by Netanyahu, and other various ways people expressed their opinion about the bombing. I think it was a successful demonstration in that it showed you could oppose the bombing without falling into the trap of supporting a theocracy. You're mute. We can't hear you. Sorry, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
If anybody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself or to put it in the chat.
Yeah, why don't people put the word stack in the chat? I'm going to first put the name of the websites of the sponsoring organizations in there, and then is the chat open for the public now, Dan?
Yes, it should be.
Okay, so if you'd like to ask a question or if you want to talk, we'll have like a 2-minute time limit on any remarks, and then if it's a question, we'll ask Yassamine Mather for a comment. There was a demonstration in Hartford yesterday. It was 103 degrees, but about 25, 30 people did come out with signs. We'll have that on the struggle video. But it took a lot of energy and bottled water for people to do that day. But if you have a question, please write the word stack in the chat, and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute. Interesting. May I ask a question about the labor movement? We saw some statements in the chat. Maybe you see the word Siavash Shahabi. He's a Iranian who I believe is in exile in Greece, and he talked about the statements by a number of unions. And Yasmin, I don't think you talked about that. Are unions important? Number one, or are they all underground or whatever? And are they speaking out about the war?
The statement he's referring to was signed by a very large number of workers' organizations. Now, some of these are not really legal. They're semi-open, semi-legal, if you know what I mean, like the Wahed Bus Company workers, the Association of Free Trade Unions. They are part of that toleration that I've said the last few months we have seen, but it doesn't mean they are free as such. Very often they're arrested, their leaders are arrested and then released. And their statement was that workers demand an end to this war, we demand an end to the bombing, we can't continue our struggles under these circumstances, which was very true. Two of the places that Israel bombed in Tabriz on the third day of the bombing were factories. One is called Tractor Sazi. It's a tractor making factory. It's an old establishment where there is tradition of labor struggles. There's tradition of leftist activities. And another one was a factory, Asaluye factory. Again, in Asaluye factory, we had a series of workers' protests, workers' strikes. And to go and bomb these two was really, if you were serious about the Iranian people, you wouldn't do that. But obviously, as far as Israel was concerned, they were part of the infrastructure. Israel wanted to weaken the infrastructure and it bombed it. So we had the leaflets from, it's a very long list. It includes retired employees, teachers, nurses, so on. And they all joined forces to sign this leaflet. So I'm glad that it exists in English. I have a copy of a translation, but it's not great. So
Thank you. Laura is on stack. If you could unmute yourself and speak.
Hi, yeah, thank you for coming and speaking on this. So I wanted to know, first of all, how much do you feel that this sort of greater plan that has been in motion for a while of this idea of the Project for a New American Century to take over the entire Middle Eastern oil supply, how much of a factor do you think that is in all of this, if any? And also, do you think that if it does go into wider war, do you feel that Russia would get involved? Do you feel that China would get involved? Like, if you could just kind of give a bigger overview of all of that.
thanks very much. Very good questions. Yeah. So even after we heard the ceasefire, I think the Americans are proposing this idea that the Abraham's Accord has now a future. Now, the reason the Abraham Accord is facing a problem in the Middle East has nothing to do with Iran. It's because the ordinary population, Arab population of various countries are rebelling against their own dictators who wanted to sign the Abraham Accord. So in a way, it's really a different issue. And I don't think it would be that easy. But I think you're absolutely right, that's within the US administration, there is this idea of changing the map of the Middle East. Changing the map of the Middle East does include getting rid of anyone who disses the wishes of the United States. They don't need to be a threat, but they don't obey immediately what the US is saying. And really, that's all you can say about Iran's Islamic Republic. It hasn't done anything. I mean, I meet Palestinians who keep telling me, before all of this, they were telling me, well, Iran didn't do much for Palestinians over the last 2 years, nearly 2 years, where we are facing this genocide. So it's really making sure there is no one who is not in line. And of course, if you achieve that, then the Abraham Accord can happen because you've moved the Palestinians out of Gaza, you've stopped opposition, the population, even those who are opposed in Egypt or Jordan to the local dictators, will have no hope. Iran is defeated, so you can go somewhere with that. In terms of oil, I'm not sure. I think for the US, the main issue is to stop cheap oil getting to China. So obviously, this is partly because if I understand it correctly, the US is now self-sufficient in terms of fuel. What it's trying to do is And here, Iran has been under sanction, has been giving oil very cheaply to China, very cheaply, because it has no choice. Nobody else buys Iranian oil. And the Chinese don't pay in dollars because they want to hide it from, of course, now we know Trump knows that Iran sells cheaper. Everyone knows Iran sells cheap oil to China, but they hide the amount by using the Chinese currency and various other ways they found to, if you like, avoid detection by SWIFT and other US dominated organizations. So yes, the idea here is to stop Iran and other countries selling oil to China at a cheap price. It's part of the global strategic view of weakening China. It makes sense for the US. In terms of your second question, well, there are a number of debates about Russia and China's attitude to the 12-day bombing of Iran. And here, there is disappointment. Disappointment because for all the, if like, claims of the Islamic republics that they are best friends with Putin, well, Putin didn't do anything for Iran. And I knew he wouldn't, because for him, it's not, he's someone who's got his own dictatorial interests in mind. He's not interested in peace or countries that it allies with. So Russia claimed it was trying to mediate some negotiations, but I don't think even that was serious. Russia has good relations with Israel. In fact, I think Putin was questioned about this last week, and he said, well, a lot of Russians live in Israel, and Israel is the second largest Russian-speaking country or something like that. And of course, there is a lot more to it in terms of Russia's relations with Israel. And that might explain also Israel's position regarding Ukraine and all sorts of other issues that we know. China is even more questionable. Well, China has an ambition, as far as I can tell, and that is to become the first hegemon power by defeating the US as a hegemon power. This won't happen tomorrow, it won't happen next year, but they have this policy of doing this. And in that, they are ruthless. They would sell anything that any ally in order to achieve that. And Iran isn't worth them fighting. They issue statements, they pass a resolution in the UN. They probably phone Iran and the Iranian leaders and say, oh, we are definitely backing you. But they're not going to risk a global war on the question of Iran. It's not worth it. And they haven't done it in the past. They haven't done anything for Gaza. I was, before the attack on Iran, someone was asking me about China and Gaza. And my response was, well, a young Swedish activist took a boat. I know she didn't succeed, but she took a boat as a gesture. That was important, to go to Gaza and help the Palestinians. There's the second largest economic power of this world. It says it's got technology far advanced of US, and in some areas, in my own area, I know it has huge technological advances. It did absolutely nothing about Gaza. What has China done about Gaza? Why can't it send at least ships to reduce starvation in Gaza? So I think the people of the Middle East who have been given this false hope of a resistance from Russia and China, a hope that they might be the saviors of the people of global South, should really look at facts and see how these countries are not going to help the peoples of the Middle East. Thank you anyway.
I want to share something with you all. Oh, that's the wrong thing, evidently. And this is from Ma'ariv, which is a big Israeli paper, 1984, and the translation in 84, Iran is in the final stages of making a nuclear bomb. I mean, this nonsense has been going on for a long time.
Yes.
And you had Trump was confronted by his own intelligence director. And in March, she said, we do not believe the collective wisdom of the U.S. intelligence agencies is that Iran is not making a bomb. And Trump just dismissed it cavalierly. I don't care what she said. They were just days away. I mean, just crap. I want to also remark that we didn't get into the legal aspects of any of this, but law, I think, was one of the great aspects of civilization, and we seem to be just tearing that up. We're back to might makes right. The big powers do whatever they want. There's no any effort to limit what you can do in a war. Heck with that. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. And certainly what they did to Iran was illegal by what was international law. You can't just say a country threatens me. It has to be attacking you physically or an obvious preparation on your border. The troops are marshaling and all that kind of stuff. And certainly none of that applied. There was a perfectly good treaty that the U.S. had with Iran that was negotiated during Obama, and that clearly would have stopped Iran from making a nuclear bomb. And if you recall Trump's criticisms, he made a few general things saying, it's all fake and all that. But he said, the neoconservatives said, well, it's about nuclear weapons, but what about all these other bad things Iran is doing? And that's why this treaty is unacceptable, and there still should be sanctions. I mean that what had been negotiated would have been perfectly adequate. In addition, Iran agreed to all kinds of inspections, even in, I don't know if I pronounce it right, Fordow, that had been inspected. And, they said they had this and that. I mean, I don't think any place in the world has been inspected in terms of nuclear facilities as much as Iran. But all that was just torn up, and the propaganda comes. It has to be done. It's absolutely pathetic. And then the last thing is this old, outmoded document called the U.S. Constitution. The theory was when they established this government that you don't want all the power in one house in the administration and the president. You want to have different parts so they would argue. So things that got done would really have to be done with a huge consensus. And so they gave power to declare war to Congress. And that hasn't been done since 1941. So it's pretty pathetic. We're ready for other people to speak. There's still, I think, 15, 16 people after an hour, which is good. If you have a point of view, if you've seen demonstrations in the U.S. or heard about them or have ideas for what might be done, we'd like to hear from you. Or we could call it a day and, we could consider what has gone on. Yassamine, do you have any final comments?
Just one comment on the JCPOA. You're absolutely right. The problem is that when Trump came to power the second time and said, I want to make this deal with Iran, these negotiations were going on, everyone knew this would go nowhere because you couldn't get anything better than JCPOA, which he walked out of. So this whole months of negotiations where he did this showman's thing. You remember every time Witkoff met the Iranian foreign minister, Trump appeared and said, "Oh, we're making good progress. They're tough to negotiate, but we're making." It's all looks like it was all for show, and you can imagine that there is no trust. Okay, I personally don't trust the Islamic Republic either. But imagine you were in their place. You couldn't believe anything that this president says, because what would be the point of negotiating a nuclear deal when your experience of the last few months is that it was just waiting for bombing to happen. It was wasting time to prepare for an attack.
We do have a question or a comment from Dan Fisher. Dan, if you could unmute yourself, go ahead.
Sure. I was just wondering if you wanted to comment on what seems to me the theatrical, spectacular nature of these confrontations. According to an Iranian source called Amwaj, the U.S. had warned Iran ahead of time about their attacks on the Iranian targets. And of course, Iran warned the U.S. ahead of time on about their attacks on the U.S. bases in Qatar. And it just seems like this whole thing is has this theatrical, spectacular air that amongst other functions might be diverting attention away from the enormous repression going on domestically in both nations. And so I just wondered what you thought about that.
Okay, that's a very good question. And okay, so I think the US didn't warn Iran, but the US could have done a lot more than what it did, right? So I don't know what they promised Netanyahu, but now when you look at the way this attack on Saturday night happened, you could say it was part of a plan to get to a ceasefire. Right. So it's a very face-saving situation for Trump and Netanyahu, because they're saying, okay, we've destroyed Iran's nuclear industry. The reality is they haven't. From everything I read, that's not the case, but it gives them that. When I heard that Qatar is already aware that Iran will attack on Sunday evening, I was thinking, what is going on here? How did they know what is happening? Is Iran using a decoy? It wasn't, as you rightly point out. It was a very well-rehearsed retaliation. So in 2020, when Trump, in his first presidency, killed General Soleimani, the leader of Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Iran's retaliation was exactly similar. So they gave an information that they were going to attack Erbil and this base in Qatar, and that's what they did. And they gave long enough warning for the US to move personnel from these places so that American blood isn't spilled. Because if American blood is spilled, my understanding is US presidents go to war anyway. Go to bomb the place. So this was very well rehearsed, very constrained, very planned in some ways. And that is why I wasn't surprised when yesterday this ceasefire was announced, because you were thinking, what is going on here? This isn't the normal scenario of what I expected immediately after hearing that the US has bombed Iran. I thought this would go on. There would be a series of bombings against Iran. Eventually, maybe some form of troops used. I know the US has great issues with using troops in a country after Iraq, but I don't know, some other form of destroying more or killing more, and then a collapse of the Islamic Republic. But that definitely isn't something they wanted, because this attack was very, how can I say, choreographed, both sides, as you say. And so we have to think, I mean, in a way, I think Trump I don't know enough about US to know how much he's under pressure from his own supporters, but Trump doesn't want a long, protracted war in the Middle East right now. He might want it later, but he doesn't want that now. And in order to overthrow the Islamic Republic, you do need to commit yourself to that. It won't happen even with 10 days of bombing, 20 days of bombing, right? So he doesn't want to commit himself to that. And Iran is a very astute at survival. For the clerics in Iran, the main thing is staying in power and continuing repression. They couldn't care less how many individual civilians are killed or whatever. That's not the issue. The issue is not even the nuclear weapon, it's their survival. And they manage, in some ways, they managed this. So both sides have things to show to their own supporters. The Islamic Republic is saying, we came under attack by a superpower and we survived. So they can say this. I would say the superpower didn't want to overthrow you, otherwise you wouldn't have survived. It was a very choreographed attack on your nuclear installation. And Israel can make the same, the other claim, oh, we is no longer a big threat. I think for Netanyahu, continuing a war in the region, if it's not with Iran, he'll find somebody else, is useful because it diverts attention from genocide in Gaza. But how he will go about it, I don't know.
Well, thank you, Yassamine Mather, and everybody who is on the Zoom. I think it's been enlightening. We've learned a lot, and of course, the genocide in Gaza keeps on going, and every day we see this insane sadism of food being given out by this humanitarian organization, this Israeli humanitarian organization, where they shoot, scores of people who are just desperate for any kind of food, and we have to definitely protest that. So we're going to end up, and I appreciate everybody who's been here, and once again, thank you, Yassamine Mather.
Thank you very much for inviting me and very good questions. Thank you.